My name is Erin Victoria Scott, and I am a 7th generation Unitarian Universalist on the Universalist side. Growing up, I was told of the great deeds of the UU movement as a whole and the parts my family played in that movement. For example, one of the branches of my family founded a Universalist congregation in Camp Hill, Alabama in the 1800s. That congregation became the largest Universalist church in the southeastern United States in the first half of the 20th century. My great-grandmother, Mary Slaughter, who grew up in that church in Camp Hill, was so well known in the Universalist church throughout the country for her work in religious education that when she married Reverend Clinton Scott, who was a Universalist minister from Vermont, he was known as Mary Slaughter's husband. A lesser man might have been insecure to have a wife more famous than himself in the 1930s, but Mary and Clinton were what we might now call a power couple. They were so outspoken about religious freedom, education, and racial injustice that the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses on their lawn. When Mary and Clinton lived in Peoria, Illinois, Clinton's preaching drew the wrath of Al Capone, and the mob threatened to kidnap their son Peter, my grandfather. So Clinton and Mary sent Peter to live with Mary's mother in Camp Hill, where he would be safely out of reach of Al Capone. In my early 20s, I struck out on a circuitous road trip across the United States, and since I would be passing through Alabama, I asked my grandfather where to find the church my ancestors had built. Where was the farm where he spent some of his childhood? Where was my great-grandmother and her family buried? What I learned shocked me, though it should not have. I had just never put the pieces together. But when he used the word plantation, it all suddenly snapped into place. I was in my 20s. With all of the family stories I'd been told, how could this massive fact that I was the descendant of slave owners have never been said or acknowledged? I tried to stay calm and just let this new information sink in as my grandfather continued to tell me stories of his childhood. He told me about a little girl that he was friends with and played with every day, but they couldn't have lunch together because she had to eat in the kitchen and he had to eat out in the dining room. My grandfather had no specific directions for my journey, just the name of the town with our church at its center. My grandfather told me the plantation house had long ago been swallowed by kudzu, but I might be able to find its front steps. He said they had a distinctive shape, but honestly, I didn't have the courage to look for them on that trip. When I had asked him about the family grave plot, he again couldn't give me any specific directions, but assured me that it wouldn't be too hard to find. He said, "You're related to all the white people in town and half the black ones. Just ask somebody." I don't know for sure, but considering interracial marriage was not legal in Alabama until 1967, the implication here is that my apparently many African American relatives are the descendants of slave mothers raped by my ancestors. My road trip took on a feeling of a pilgrimage. I found the family grave plot and walked among their graves and read aloud the names on the stones. I thought about how very different my life is from theirs, and I prayed for God to forgive them. I prayed for God to help me to forgive them. As I knelt in the cold, dry grass by their stones, I vowed to do everything I could with my one little life to undo what harm they have done. So when Verdis and I were preparing our first service together a year ago, he asked me, "How do you engage with your family history?" And today I want to ask you that same question. We all have our own mythology, stories we tell about ourselves, about who we are as a person, a family, a congregation, a nation. There are parts of our history that we like to, need to, lift up, to celebrate, to emulate, to say, "This is America," for example. And other parts of our stories that we would rather ignore, turn away from, or deny entirely because they are painful truths. It is confusing to be proud of and ashamed of the same people, to have Universalist ministers who were slave owners. But shame and denial will not help us heal. We can't change the past, but we have a responsibility to engage with our past. In order to get out of this mess, we have to take an honest look at ourselves. In the spirit of the third principle, acceptance of one another and engagement to spiritual growth, I would like to share with you 6 key practices that I use to stay in right relation. 1. Learn the history of our country that was not taught in schools. 2. Seek out contemporary stories, the experiences of people who are classified by society as other from me and therefore experience the world very differently than I do. And 3. Believe them. 4. I make a habit to take direction from and follow the leadership of the descendants of slaves. This helps me stay in right relation. 5. I try to rescue my ethnicity from generic whiteness. By learning about and expressing the culture of my specific European heritage, I can help break down the supremacy and normalization of generic white culture. And 6, I try to actively engage with dismantling of society's structures of oppression and actively construct new systems of reparation that will eventually lead to equity.
Okay, we may journey to the valley of shadow and death for a little while, but I promise to bring us out of it. One of the writings that helped me to navigate from my African American Holiness Pentecostal upbringing to Universalism was Bishop Carlton Pearson's Gospel of Inclusion. But I could not grapple with the concept of a hell-less afterlife. The concept of evildoers and sinners being dragged kicking and screaming into heaven just didn't sit well with me, especially after researching my family history. My ancestral journey took me to the red clay of Southwest Georgia, literally to an area named Red Hill. I can smell the red clay right now on my grandmother's farm. For it was on that hill that my great-great-grandfather, Reuben Walls, was born. And he was born enslaved. My grandmother told me how when Reuben was 9 years old and was working in the fields and all of the enslaved people on the Walls plantation were called to the gathering place in the middle of the slave quarters. I don't know if you can tell I'm sitting, but I'm pretty short. I'm about 5'2", and he was short like me. So he came to the front so that he could see. And when he got to the front, he saw his mother. She was tied to a post, naked. And without words, the slave master proceeded to whip her and whip her and whip her until the blood ran down her back. And she died in front of her children. You see, Red Hill's red clay had more than iron in it. And as a Unitarian Universalist, I often think about if I were to see that man in heaven, that man that murdered my ancestor, what would I say to him? What would I say? What would I ask him? And you know what? I would ask him, what was her name? What was her name? We don't even know her name. No burial site, no tombstone, just the painful memories of her son, my great-great-grandfather, who only knew her as Mama. I want to know her name so that I can honor her and her blood that flows in my veins, so that I can lay my burdens down by the riverside and study war no more, as the old African-American spiritual says. Because that burden, has plagued my family till this very day. For I thought I knew what the spiritual that I had grew up singing meant. Don't study war, don't fight battles, let God fight your battles, or someone else for that matter. War is a burden, fighting is a burden. Let someone else study war. Let someone else fight battles, lay down those burdens. But that study, that concept awoken something in me. Not really a spirit of pacifism, but I know now that I have to study war. I have to take up my sword and shield. I have to carry a heavy load. I have to carry the burdens. I have to carry the burdens of truth, of honor, the burdens of justice, the burdens of right versus wrong, to war against poverty, to war against racism, to war against inequality, tyranny, exclusivity, homophobia. We must study war with the hopes and belief that once the battle is won, once the wars are over and we are victorious, once we have eliminated poverty from our communities, once we have eliminated racism, inequality, tyranny from our world, then we are going to study war no more, because we won't have to. There will be nothing to fight, no burdens to carry. We will be able to study war no more. You see, this interpretation speaks to who we are, the ways that we fight for social justice. We can do it passively, but not by bowing down to it. We can do it politically, but not by bowing down to it. We can do it through protest, but not by bowing down to it. We can do it through service, good deeds, being inclusive, being thoughtful, mindful, but not to give up just yet, but thinking about the end goal that we can study war no more. What a beautiful day that will be. That Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's dream of the children of former slaves and slave owners will be able to sit down at the table of brotherhood. Today, I would say the table of humanity. That would be a dream realized rather than a dream deferred. But we are not done yet. So let that dream motivate you to action. Let that hope keep you in the trenches, because we are building a new way. We are working to be free. We can feed our every need as peace and freedom is our cry. Let that power of love be the doctrine of our church. And let our service to the earth, to the world, to each other, be its prayer. Be encouraged, and blessed be.